Good morning. We're on the record. Today is Friday, October 25th. We're scheduled from 10 to 11 today for this work session regarding the various budgets relating to homelessness. And we'll start with introductions. Mr. Martinez.
George Martinez.
Cameron Perez Radia.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Daniel Volant.
Zach Johnson.
Christopher Constant on the phone. Mr. Salt.
Randy Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Thank you, Ms. Brawley.
Hello.
Hi, thanks. Anyone else on the phone who is a member? No. Okay, we'll go ahead and dive in. Ms. Browse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ona Browse, Office of Management and Budget. I would like to thank everybody for being here today. We are going to present on the homelessness budget for the municipality using the alcohol tax and other fund sources. We'll start with sort of a look back into, or we'll not start with, but we'll do a look back into how the alcohol tax has been appropriated over the last few years, discuss mayoral priorities and the budget that has been presented as part of the 25 proposed, and additional details as we answer member questions and get into some of the very refined details. But we can start with Katie. She's going to take the slide deck.
Thank you all. Morning. Thank you, Chair. Katie Skovic, Chief of Staff in the Mayor's Office, and then I'm joined here with Farina Brown and Thea Agnew-Bembin, who are both special assistants to the Mayor. So I'll kick us off, and then it'll be a team effort. So we're going to talk through homelessness as well as the alcohol tax, which are separate but related. We'll talk about background context and for both sort of how we got here and what have been some of the trends in recent years, and then what are we proposing for 2025. Wanted to start by just putting us in the big picture context of the mayor's budget goals, which include addressing homelessness head on, which we'll talk about today, expanding and aligning Anchorage's crisis response services, which includes bringing the mobile crisis team to 24/7, fully funding or fully budgeting for the Anchorage Safety Patrol and moving that service into the fire department. I think a lot of us are thinking about snow on the way, or at least I am. So making investments to improve snow removal, both on the fleet side, but also operator pay, investing in traffic calming and safe public spaces. And a lot of that you'll see in the capital budget. And then supporting childcare and early education. Later today, there will be a conversation, I believe, about the Anchorage Childcare and Early Education Fund, which will be deployed for the first time in 2025. And then none of that can happen if we don't get the basics right. And so continuing to think about and invest in core municipal services and the staff who make it all happen. Want to start on the homelessness piece by just continuing to remind folks that we have a health and homelessness strategy. It's a living document that Ms. Brown and Ms. Agnew-Bembin have spent a good deal of time on and that you all have hopefully seen. Just wanting to highlight what the big picture 3-year goals of that strategy are. 1, to significantly reduce unsheltered homelessness. 2, to increase access to behavioral and physical health services. 3, to add new housing and increase access to existing housing. And 4, to harness partnerships, funding, and data so that we are increasing our overall impact here in the municipality. Here is a visual of that document. I think we all feel excited that the 100-day goals have check marks on them. So also just to say, this is very much the driving document we're using on our homelessness and health work. It includes 100-day goals, 6-month goals or actions, and then first year actions. And so as we're thinking about what we're proposing to fund, we're really thinking about what are the actions and the strategies that we think we need to take, and also how could some of that shift over time. So I do just want to point out, we've talked a lot about some of the practical realities of where we are right now. And I think for this administration, the practical realities of coming in on July 1 and turning around a budget, and some of the RFPs and things that services we'll talk about today were already in formation or heading out the door. when we came in. We're also quickly approaching winter, and there's a baseline of public safety and health to consider when we think about things like winter shelter. But also this plan is built so that what we're doing today is responsive to today, but we're not sort of necessarily accepting that as our long-term reality. And so we want to be making investments that mean we need less expensive emergency services, that we're not in time crunches to stand those up each fall, et cetera. So that's big picture how we're thinking about what we're funding now and where we're heading. Here are some homelessness related highlights or some major investments proposed in the 2025 budget. Funding for the congregate shelter at 56th Avenue, which will be maintained as a year-round shelter that serves up to 200 individuals. The exciting part there, and I know members here worked on this, is that that is a matching fund to a state grant. And so the municipality's portion is there at the top, and then we'll also be leveraging those state dollars to keep that shelter stood up. There's been a lot of ongoing conversation about non-congregate winter shelter. So that's the projected 2025 number, assuming that we have 400 beds stood up. Director Rash can speak to this more as needed, but there is also some CDBG COVID funding earmarked for non-congregate shelter that's also helping just plug gaps and make sure we're funding existing contracts. And then the unified funding proposal, that's split out in your alcohol tax budget, so you can see the detail, but wanted to just pull all of that in one place and show what that total ends up being. A lot of that's going to align with other dollars and support other shelter in the municipality for family, for youth, as well as outreach work. And so those are investments we're making that ensure there, again, is that baseline level of service. Healthy Spaces, the 2025 proposed budget includes a 10% increase in funding for camp abatement and cleanup. And so that's the number reflected there. And then there are also some ESG funds, Emergency Solution Grant Funds, which is a federal program through HUD that's going to fund homelessness prevention. And I'll just caveat, we'll go into some more detail as well, but we're doing a whole bunch of digging and analysis. And so this is sort of what we've pulled so far, and we'll continue to share more information as we're pulling things together in one place. So it's called highlights and not exhaustive list because of that. Any questions before we go? Yeah.
I may have missed, but, oh, I'm sorry, jumped right in. What is ESG? Okay, thanks.
I have a question. I'm curious, the Healthy Spaces funding, how this is alcohol tax specific. It certainly feels like a stretch. Is that new money?
I think that's to the chair, how that was funded previously. And this is just a slight increase in that. I believe it was actually has been funded through the alcohol tax for 3 or 4 years now.
Definitely feels like it has to find a new home soon. Thank you. Mr. Boland.
I think I have a conflicting point of view on that. I think camp cleanup is public safety. There are a lot of ecological risks that come with prohibited camping, especially when it happens for an extended time. And so I think that I can clearly draw the line to the interest in public safety. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Yeah. What was the non-congregate winter shelter from the alcohol tax last year? What was that? Is that a change in the amount?
Through the chair to member President, this is a new fund source for this non-congregate shelter. To my knowledge, I don't know if there was funding for non-congregate specifically in the alcohol tax last year. We'd have to go back and look.
Okay, thanks.
Which again raises the question, is it an acceptable expenditure under the alcohol tax? Because it was an ongoing expense. It's not a new expense. It's been happening now for, according to this chart, since 2019, 2020. And so if we're now shoehorning into the alcohol tax previous expenses, it feels like it comes at kind of crosswise of the source.
To the chairman, the non-congregate shelter funding is not in conflict with the alcohol tax the way that it was originally written. It's from the baseline funding of 2020 is what you cannot supplant general government funding with. This non-congregate appropriation, to my knowledge, is the first one of its kind as a holistic appropriation, but we can have that conversation and figure out how that works. And to be clear about it, this is really majorly a shift from how the municipality has been funding congregate shelter. And congregate shelter has been in the alcohol tax for quite some time, but congregate shelter is now in the operating budget as a commitment to the idea that the municipality is responsible for congregate emergency low barrier shelter in the community.
And to that, I just want to add that one thing we're thinking about and really trying to do is present these at the front end through the budget process. A lot of the way shelter has been funded is in a more kind of piecemeal as costs come up or as new needs arise. And what we're trying to do is look ahead to 2025 and say, what are our shelter needs? How are we going to fund them? And then create less budget scrambling later. And so the reality of that is we're showing big numbers because those are the real numbers. And it's not that the municipality hasn't been paying those costs, it's that they haven't been shown like this in the budget process. So this is a goal, this is an effort toward transparency of this is what we're paying, this is what we're getting as a result. And then we have that conversation.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, can I ask, can I continue?
Mr. President.
So yeah, it often happens this way, sort of in reverse, in that you can describe your strategy, but then when we see the numbers, then we, I think, really understand the strategy, right? And so I think this is difficult because we don't have a lot of time today to really dig into that strategy because it's a budget discussion. But what you just said was that the city is putting congregate shelter, not just emergency congregate, like winter emergency congregate shelter, but congregate shelter. And so that's an interesting conversation about whether that's our responsibility year round or what role do we play in that. And so that's one. But the other piece that I'm particularly interested in, I'm trying to figure out, is the non-congregate using of the hotel space and the reduction, my understanding, the reduction in numbers from last year to this year, and the difference in what it costs. And so I'm not seeing that comparison in here, but that would be a really good number to have in terms of what we're paying for lifting up these hotels, paying for those, especially if it's significantly less than we paid that last year.
And through the chair to member Presvidia, there's a terrible slide about 4 pages later that is almost completely illegible on what you guys have received because it is an Excel spreadsheet with lots of records in it. I'll provide the full Excel spreadsheet so that it's visible, but it is a comparison of all 4 years of the alcohol tax, the fund appropriations that went to each item individually, and how they tally up at the bottom in total. When we get to that slide, there will be lots of explanation.
Thanks.
Great. This is just to quickly summarize some of the commonly used sources that go toward homelessness, both municipal funds with general government operating dollars, as well as the alcohol tax. State funds, a recent example of that, obviously being the shelter grant.
I'm going to interrupt Anna Burley, wanted in the queue before we move on from the last slide. Go ahead, Anna.
Yeah, thanks. And I know we needed to move on. I want to restate, I'm interested in moving the camp abatement money out of alcohol tax. It was added on to the rest of the year and not the summer months. So it is it's been determined to be valid, but I think there's a policy conversation to have there. And also just to say, I appreciate the giving these numbers up front, because I think it is true. We had really no idea, unless somebody actually gave us the numbers, and they never did, from this past winter, how much we were spending on shelter. But I do also just want to say generally that I understand the goal of reducing unsheltered homelessness. I think it is a valid conversation to have, though, around whether we invest as much as we do in shelter versus other things like housing. But I know there's a complication with moving to the ideal, which is housing. But just to say, we need to still be focused on housing. So having the housing piece being goal number 3 is a little bit challenging for me. But just wanted to say that thing.
Thanks, Member Brawley. And we'll actually get to this when we talk about the alcohol tax later, but we are also very interested in how we fund housing and how we shift more toward funding housing and less toward expensive emergency shelter. And so we are excited to talk about that. And then to the piece about camp abatement, I think there's definitely openness on where that gets funded. The administration is very committed to funding that and to not decreasing it. And so I'll just put that out there as an administration priority around camp cleanup.
I don't think anybody is opposing camp cleanup. I think that it's definitely the question of where it's funded from in the long term.
All right, in the interest of time, I think I'll keep scrolling, but the last piece here is just to say that we have regular federal funds that come in the door, and then as we'll show in the next couple of slides, the last 2-3 years where pandemic-related funds came in the door really kind of changed the picture of funding going toward homelessness. And I'll turn it over to Ms. Agnew-Bembin in a second here. We're just going to go through. I want to start by saying I know some members have asked for 24 and 25 comparisons. We're working on those in terms of the more comprehensive analysis of what's been spent on homelessness across those funding sources I just showed. That analysis that we currently have cuts off at 2023. And so that's what we'll be showing here. But just to say we're working on the 24 and then proposed 25 comparison as well.
So I'm going to jump in here and say that this slide is somewhat inaccurate, and this falls into the argument that was made by the previous administration that, oh, the assembly has spent $120 million on homelessness and they haven't solved it. And in 2021 and 2022, the majority of those funds were actually set up to establish the mass care location at the Sullivan Arena for the pandemic response. It wasn't a homelessness response. And so the slide, I think, lacks nuance in the funding source, and it provides rhetoric to the community that's not exactly accurate. Fair to all be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of that argument, because it's not true. It was a COVID response.
And that argument is also not one we are trying to make. So I've also just scrolled to the next slide, which is the breakdown of municipal sources versus total sources and how federal relief was a huge part of that. And really, I'll turn it over to Ms. Agnew-Bembin to talk more about this.
Thank you. Yeah, that was exactly the point we wanted to provide for context, is that, we have gone through COVID. We did see this very significant influx of federal money. Most of that money actually, as the chair just stated, went towards rental subsidies that went across the community. Those we really consider homelessness prevention. That this is not all money that was spent on shelter by any means, which is why we have the next slide to show the breakdown there. So I think when we think about where we're at right now, even though we all really want to put COVID behind us, in many ways our community is absolutely still dealing with the impacts of that experience. And when we look at the numbers of people experiencing homelessness, we did see a very significant increase, even with this level of investment in our community, of people who became homeless and remain homeless after that experience. So I think as we think about what we're doing this year, we need to recognize that we're still dealing with impacts of that experience. Plus, we're still experiencing an opioid epidemic, and that's gone into many different phases. So we're seeing things in our community that we're hearing about from community councils, from constituent calls every day, and that's the context for this investment. And then this last slide also just shows a little bit more detail around spending in terms of municipal spending. And what you'll see is kind of when the voters decided to create the alcohol tax, that funding has allowed this kind of transition to occur between money that was being spent from general government to come from the alcohol tax and be directed towards those designated uses that the voters approved.
And I'll just add to this one that one thing we really want to talk about is I know a lot of focus ends up being on, how much of the alcohol tax is being put toward homelessness versus other things. We really want to be talking about what are we spending on homelessness? And that's sort of a flip from a starting point of the fund source to just a what are we trying to do and how much are we spending and how are we spending strategically? And so we really want to have that conversation. And that's some of what you're seeing here is that there have been changes over time in terms of what percent of that's coming from one fund source or another. But to look at the whole picture and then to have forward facing conversations again about there's some practical realities of where we are today and some critical public safety and winter needs, but also how do we start getting out of this sort of expensive cycle that we're in and getting to a spot where fewer people need that expensive service. From here, we're going to go into a little more detail on the alcohol tax, but can also take any questions before then.
Cameron?
It's just a point, and it doesn't relate directly to the budget, but just to be interesting to try to gather information about the total amount Anchorage is spending on homelessness and to be able to break that a little bit, because I'm curious whether we're as a city spending more than we ever have, or whether we're as an entire city, not as a city government, and whether the percentage of the overall funding that's going into homelessness or a response to it, whether we're paying a larger part of that, or just whether the overall cost has gone up. And so, because if you ask the nonprofits and the providers, that sort of thing, they would probably argue that the costs have significantly gone up. But I would also just say that the quality of care and service that we're doing, it has improved. I mean, if you just go to the Third Avenue NAP Center and those places like that, we were on a shoestring for years and years. And so anyway, so that's a bigger conversation, but it'd be interesting to put that into context of our budget and where our budget fits within that larger picture. I think it'd be helpful for the community to see where we fit within that. Thank you.
And related to that, how we're tracking the number of people experiencing homelessness. And so looking at how that has ebbed and flowed over time as well. And again, that split between unsheltered or not is also a big piece of this, and obviously what community members are concerned about. To that end, this isn't specifically budget related, but is related to the data piece, just an update for this group that we recently got word that the Bloomberg Harvard program that the mayor was taking part in, part of what that program offers is a year-long track to work on a problem. And so our city was selected to participate in the data track around homelessness specifically. And so that hasn't kicked off yet, but that's just to say we'll have this added outside capacity to really ask data-related questions and build up our capacity to have answers to those questions, which we're excited about.
Cameron, a question for you. When you say how much is Anchorage spending, do you mean the municipality or do you mean the city and all of its people? And okay, that's a trickier question to get to, but I think that it's good to frame it that way. Karen.
And just including other programs that are not supported by the city.
Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah,
I
is
just-
that what you're
yeah,
meaning to?
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
wanted to make sure that we were all clear what he was talking about. Go ahead.
Great, we're gonna dive into the alcohol tax from here. All right, I'm gonna kick it over to Director Brous to talk about some of the background and trends we've seen with the alcohol tax since it came into being.
So this is the terrible slide I was just talking about. I sent a version of the Excel sheet to Jasmine to see if she can print a legible version for membership. This is the crosswalk of the alcohol tax appropriation by year. So it is not necessarily the actuals that were spent. It is the total appropriations as they landed at the end of the year. What's interesting about this representation of this spreadsheet is that while it shows 4 columns between 2021, 22, 23, and 24, there are actually probably about 50 other columns that are hidden between each of those years that are the crosswalk of every time the alcohol tax was amended. So the whole spreadsheet shows every assembly action that moved alcohol tax dollars from one place to another. And it's over 10 times a year that you are processing amendments for the alcohol tax. One of the goals of the administration is to get to a place where that happens less, that there is a more holistic and comfortable appropriation in the proposed and first quarter budget process, so that there is a better understanding for both the assembly and the public to know how the alcohol tax dollars are being spent. I'm going to stand up and point at the screen. It's going to get weird. Like the 2021 year right here was, the 2021 year was 11.7 million total. And that was the projection because the first year the tax was implemented in Q2. So it was lower, or I think it was Q2. So it's lower than the annual appropriation or the annual revenue that we get from the alcohol tax on an every year basis. That's between 15 and 16 million dollars total. And that has always been the projection for the alcohol tax. At the bottom of the page, you see the column totals in 2021 is $11.7 million. And there are about 10 appropriations total for that $12 million. In the first year of the alcohol tax, the spend, I think, did not get all the way out the door. So we roll into 2022, and you see legislative action and administration action that takes the total of the alcohol tax up to $23 million because there was fund balance to spend. So much of the money from the first year of the alcohol tax that did not get out the door was rolled and appropriated into year 2. But year 2 also did not get it out the door in time. So the appropriation in year 3 is 21.2, if I can see that right. So there is a pattern of year over year fund balance transition to the tune of tens of millions of dollars over the actual revenue coming in the door. So in 2024, we have a $25 million bottom line, but the revenue is between 15 and 16 million dollars, which means that if we spent all of these rollover fund balance years, that in 2025 we have 15 to 16 million dollars to spend. So this budget of $25 million with this spend has to lose $10 million. And that is one of the reasons that this budget feels smaller than you are used to, because the last 3 years you've been talking about $20 million plus every year, and it rolls over again and rolls over again. I believe that there will be some fund balance this year from unexpended appropriations. We know that there are a few that are at 0 or 10 or 20%, excuse me. So I think part of the challenge is getting the alcohol tax back into its actual revenue totals instead of the fund balance rollover. And that is one of the challenges that we had to deal with this year. It feels like a $10 million cut.
So I would appreciate at some point soon, some kind of a pie chart that breaks down by the actuals and the categories, the buckets, so that we can see not what we're appropriating towards, but what we're actually doing with the alcohol tax. I recognize we had an administration that just really couldn't get grants out the door. And so it feels like what's going to show up is that we have spent tons of money on homelessness because of our internal costs, and that we haven't actually gotten the money out to all those other causes that were part of the charter language that we have to be very careful to meet, because that's our duty as the fiduciaries. And so, yeah, I hope we can see the visuals sometime soon.
And Mr. Chairman, I would say that actuals are part of the ACFR process. And so we have actuals through 22 right now. And we could give you unaudited spend for 23, but we are not done with 24 yet. So that would not be included, but we can get some of the
Unaudited would be
actuals in
fine.
there. Yeah.
Unaudited would be fine. Just what we have to that point. I don't care about 24 because we'll grapple with that as we go. That's your problem, not the past.
That's
problem.
our problem.
Right, sure.
Mr. Presverdia?
Sure. Just a couple questions. The categorization of these, and I realize this is budget versus, I think that's something that we just have to reconcile is what are the categories and how do they align to both our budget and the spends within those categories, and also the purpose of the alcohol tax and such. And so that reconciliation, I think, is really, really important, and it would make the pie charts and the things like that easier for us to understand. But it would also help us to understand the rationale for the spending within the categories. And so, and I guess that's where I'm going next is we know we've heard from members of the public about choices that this budget has made on what we've chose to spend and not spend. Part of that rationale, I'm assuming, based on what you just said, is a reduction in the amount that we have to spend based on previous spending. So that's maybe part of the rationale is we have to reduce. But there's also some other rationale, I would assume. And so I don't know if this is the appropriate time for that, but I'd like to hear some of that thinking about the choices, particularly in things around homelessness services, housing, rapid rehousing, these kinds of things. And the one we heard about the other night, obviously, was Home for Good. I'd love to hear some rationale for that. But is this the proper time to sort of walk through some of those budget choices and changes that were made that are reflected on this? Thanks.
Through the chair to member Perez-Redia, I will say that I apologize that this spreadsheet has not been fully edited to the level that I would like it to be. There are quite a few lines in here that say things like program operations for various departments. Those have actual details behind them with assigned staff and the duties that they are doing and the portions of the buckets that they are supposed to be assigned to. I just have not had the chance to go through and fill all of those back out based on the detail that's in SAP that comes out in this format, to clarify some of those questions. But the other piece of this, there's some other detail in future slides that gets into some of what you were talking about. Whether or not the detailed conversation can happen right now, I don't know that we have enough time, but I believe, there's a month between right now and passage and scheduling either via the committee meetings or another work session, I think is.
Grace Brawley.
Thanks. Yeah, in terms of the past spending, I'll also point folks back to the alcohol tax strategic plan. There was, obviously there was forward-looking work, but it also documents, at least in broad strokes, what was funded. And then to Mr. Perez-Verdia's point, I think that was really the conversation that we weren't ready to have at that point because we didn't have numbers before us. So I think it'll partly be through this budget process, and then hopefully prospectively after that, really talking about the long term with alcohol tax, but we can look back to the plan as at least a starting point, and then obviously make changes as we need to.
So, Mr. Voland.
Thank you. So yeah, definitely appreciate this representation and the rollover of unspent funds. I guess my question is, how confident are we that there's going to actually be a change in how quickly we're able to get funds out?
Through the chair to member Voland, frankly, it depends on how the appropriations are made. If you, in the first column in 2021, you'll notice that the health department appropriation is $4 million. And that was the bulk of the initial grant program to go to DVSA prevention. And there are significant challenges with the process and administration of grant funds for nonprofit organizations and the way the municipality is able to process them. That first year was very challenging for the health department to onboard without staff and without additional support to really understand how that would be done. I think the nature of that challenge shows up in the rollover and rollover, because once we established that in year one, it was more difficult to catch up to in 2, 3, and 4. So one of the challenges that I see with the way that this alcohol tax has trended over time is that it is getting more and more specific with named recipient grants that become a more challenging administration problem than buckets of funding and competitive processes that are already in place. We are exploring part of the conversation with this body has been, how should we change that? Can we change that? What does that look like? And it's our intention to have that conversation and move forward in the direction of simplifying these appropriations to be closer to a municipal budget that does not include named recipient grants, but does have opportunities for those organizations to continue to be funded.
Okay, thanks.
I want to also add, we have an example that was mentioned of an organization that received 5 years of direct sole source money with a commitment started and a commitment finished. And so I think that that conversation is the one that we really need to figure out where we're going in the context of, are we directly benefiting a single entity, or are we going to go back to the not generally a patronage process, instead a competitive process? And so I think that that's the trend we've seen and heard in the conversation for probably the last 12 months. And I look forward to us getting to that place where we're not just picking winners and losers, but we're letting them compete with other organizations to demonstrate who has the best.
Thanks. So, okay, I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. A competitive process is going to be more timely distribution of funds than direct grants. How and why? I guess I don't understand.
I think two different pieces there. One is about, are we putting funds out competitively? And we've seen a trend where there have been more direct grants called out to organizations, that those amounts have actually grown over time. And so we really want to stop. And you'll see some of this is reflected in the 25 budget, and some of this is a conversation we want to have about 2026, about just how are we putting funds out more competitively. The other piece you're speaking to is the administration and of grant programs, and that's another piece we want to talk about. My sense is there's good steps happening in terms of streamlining that, making it better. But I think in the ACE fund conversation later in particular, we want to talk about our tendency to stand up new programs and we budget now and then expect a new program to exist, and how are we planning for the administration and staff capacity of the health and other departments at the municipality to actually be set up for success when we do that. So the administration piece of grant programs is another conversation, and one that we want to have, but we generally are supportive of more funds going out competitively versus as direct grants to named entities.
Yeah, great. I think that the body feels that way as well. I guess, I will just leave it at, I think it's frustrating to the appropriators when the funds that we appropriate don't go out timely, and then the good work that is intended with those funds is not able to be accomplished in the community. And so anything that we can do to support code changes or other things that we did one recently to allow for electronic submission, et cetera, or multi-year, whatever it takes, just want to make sure that the money actually goes where it is intended. Thanks.
Just a quick kind of follow up, I just want a finer point really quick, and that is that I agree with everything that was said. I think that I actually do believe that if you do a competitive process every single year, it's going to be more costly and more time consuming and things. I mean, I think there is a role of these multi-year grants of identifying organizations that are uniquely prepared to provide a really important service, but that we're really transparent and open about that. And so that if there is another organization that'd like to compete with that, they know they need to wait the 3 years. And then that's the point at which that they're going to compete for that multi-year contract. But I think as in terms of efficiency and quality of service, I think looking at multi-year grants in addition to a yearly competitive process for certain things is really important. Thanks.
And through the chair to member Presverdia, I would like to clarify, the language we've been using is the competitive process. I'd like to say an open process. Depending on how the funding buckets are decided as part of the budget process, then there would be a different open process for that to be appropriated or determined outside of the budget process itself. And the municipality uses the term grant and contract interchangeably, and some of that is very challenging. The multi-year option is something that we have talked about internally for exactly the reason you have mentioned. If we are going to get programmatic about how this is done, then we can look at things the way we look at term contractors, the way we look at what the outcomes are, the way we look at what the needs of the community are, and with the focused attention of a very specific set of time, we can shift appropriately.
I would add slightly to that, this body will in no way give up its authority and right to authorize grants to specific entities, right? That is our power, and in fact, is the only way. We can't direct contracts to entities in the same way that we can grants. And so the body does not give away or will not give away that right, but there is a practical reality that we have to do this to be successful in achieving the highest best interests. And the multi-year conversation is easy. The state does 3 or 5, depends. I do love the idea of term contracts on specific functions. And so, yeah, just as a branch, we do have the right, and, you know, we have confronted this reality where the other branch says, no, you can't make that contract. And then council says, but you can make a grant. And then we do. And so that's kind of how we got to where this list grew and they're getting bigger, was this inherent conflict. And so when we move back towards inherent collaboration, it becomes easier to follow these practices and protocols that are best practice, which is to be open or competitive or whatever terms we want to use. All right, we are going to be out of time though. We have about 13 minutes and a lot still to cover. I know I've been talking too much. Go ahead.
Great. This is some of what we were just talking about, but just to say some of how the administration thinks about the alcohol tax. So obviously maintaining a commitment to apply alcohol tax revenue to voter approved uses. Thinking about how the alcohol tax again combines with other funding sources and how are we strategically prioritizing the big challenges Anchorage faces and that the public is asking us to solve. Shifting away again from direct grants to organizations to more open competitive processes like we've talked about. Again, some of this appears in the 2025 budget, but a lot of that is going to be probably part of a 2026 budget conversation. And then another thing we've heard from the community, which is just wanting to more clearly see and understand what their taxpayer dollars are going toward. I know the Assembly's done a lot of work on that front, but we're also wanting to do that alongside you. In terms of how we're thinking about just what are we kind of getting for the alcohol tax dollars, these are some of the big priorities. Bringing the mobile crisis team to 24/7 operations, funding emergency cold weather shelter, and again, putting that in as part of the budget process, not some kind of kicking the can to later as a budget problem to solve a couple months from now. Investing in housing, which we'll talk about in a second. Increasing funding for camp cleanup. In this budget, continuing to support grants to providers. And then again, continuing to support municipal staff who are operationalizing the tax through the police and health departments, as well as the municipal attorney's office. And one note here, just from where the first alcohol tax budget was to where we are now, less and less money or less money has been spent funding municipal positions. More of those have been absorbed by the operating budget. That first budget had, I think, nearly $3 million going directly to fund municipal staff. It's now about 1 million. And so just to flag that for this group, that more of that's been absorbed outside of this tax or this revenue. Here are some of the totals just to flag again what I was just walking through in terms of what we're funding and what the cost comes out to. Emergency cold weather shelter, the non-congregate amount is there at the top. That's January to May. Unified funding proposal with the organizations that receive that funding below. So that's everything from complex care shelter to shelter that serves families to shelter and services that serve youth to outreach. And so that's how we're, again, kind of coming alongside and investing in other organizations, but just want folks to see that total come together and really, again, just transparently see what we're putting in there. Municipal staff, again, folks who are implementing the alcohol tax, bringing the mobile crisis team to 24/7. And then there's a highlighted line here, and this came up before, about how are we continuing to invest in housing programs? How are we thinking about what housing is needed in the community? We're excited to have that as an ongoing conversation with this body in the budget process and beyond. We actually, I think Ms. Brown and Ms. Agnew-Benben have maybe 2 or 3 meetings today, between meeting with folks in the health department, folks over at ACDA, et cetera, about what are funds we could leverage and spend on housing. And so this is, again, part of that thinking less in terms of fund source and more in terms of what are we trying to do and what are all of the funding options we could leverage. And so we're excited to report back on those conversations and have a back and forth with you all on what we fund in the housing realm, and know that we need to be putting dollars there. And also, like we said before, just over time, wanting more resources to go toward that and sort of shift down the resources need for more expensive emergency services. And then the rest of these are things we've all talked about and that are in your budget document. So maybe I'll just pause there.
Yeah, so there's no number there, and you just said it's a priority. And so where are we funding that priority from, if not here?
And that's what the meetings today are about, or what other funding sources are available to line up here. And we anticipate this is a back and forth conversation, and that there will be another version of the budget. And so we anticipate, we haven't put a number there because we don't have the number, and we're trying to be honest about what are real numbers and what are not. But we anticipate there being funding in this budget for housing, and also that we're capturing and, again, transparently communicating with you all what other funding sources that aren't a part of the municipality's 2025 budget process, but that could be put toward this goal. So to me, that's a follow-up conversation sooner rather than later.
Mr. Presverdia, Ms. Braga after.
Yeah, just a quick one on this. I'm thinking about first quarter budget revisions, and I'm wondering your strategy around, are these numbers in some way reflective of intentions towards for first quarter? I'm wondering about some of the sort of investments you're looking at making, and whether in some cases these are less than what you intend, and that there is an intention to come back in some of these areas. Just want to understand your strategy there. Thanks.
Through the chair to member Presverdia, the intention is looking towards not only 1Q, but an S version for the proposed budget. Part of this process, as Ms. Skovic said, is the conversation and collaboration that we're having with the assembly, with the public, with the entities within the alcohol tax, the timeframe for producing the budget and onboarding all of that detail was relatively short. I also understand that if we front load a budget, it gets harder to take it back out. So making sure that we understand what we are including at what numbers was very important as part of the early process. As I said before, there is likely to be some fund balance available within the alcohol tax that will be rolled over into the 2025 year and can be added to the appropriations. As part of the conversation from the last work session, we're looking at moving some of the items out of the alcohol tax into general government as possible, so that there are additional funds available in the alcohol tax to go towards some of these priorities. So all of that will be part of the conversation going forward. You'll see some changes, I believe, before the passage on November 19th, and there will be more changes as part of first quarter.
Thank you.
Karen.
Thank you. So I'm looking at, I want to make sure I'm seeing this right. So all of the mental health, substance misuse, the only appropriation is mobile crisis team. So I'm not from this page, everything that had money last year, there's none. And the only thing I see is mental health. And then for child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence, the only thing that you have right now is the evidence-based grants to providers, the 1 million. So if I'm reading this right, you've got 2,400,000 toward two of the buckets, and the entire rest of it is toward homelessness. Is that correct?
A couple additions to what you said. The direct grants to address domestic violence and sexual assault is another line to that first bucket. And then the training modules for the police department are part of the first responder piece. Again, I think what we can also provide as a follow-up, and maybe I can actually just click to the next slide. Something we want to just keep doing as we talk about the alcohol tax is there's saying, what are we funding in general? And so what you're not seeing in the alcohol tax, but which has been funded, at least in part, out of that before, is something like the safety patrol, which we're fully absorbing in the operating budget. And so that's not going away, and that service still exists, but it just doesn't appear in the alcohol tax. And so that's part of the, how do we both look at fund sources, but then the kind of other cross-cutting layer of just what's getting funded across the budget as a whole. And so I would just point to that as one piece of how we're building out substance use response.
Another thing I just wanted to clarify, on the pink page here for the pay for success, actually it said somewhere, this enlarged page, it said 996,000 is what pay for success got last year. But I believe it says somewhere else that they got 1.8 million last year and then nothing this year. So-
Through the chair to Member Bronga, the original appropriation was 1.8 million. It was reappropriated down to under $1 million.
The 2024 amount.
Correct.
Okay.
And to, well, never mind.
Well, and I'll put just a finer point on it. It's all of that money is approximately $12 million, $8 million here, plus the 4 million from the state. So on the homeless response relative to all of those other categories that were kind of the goal is to do some upstream investment and figure out how to change the narrative and change the reality in our community. And so I think what the next slide just basically points to the fact that this is the reality. They're proposing it because they're grappling with it. And it is all of those things. And the one line that is nothing there yet, which we'll hopefully see soon, is something to address housing. Hopefully before we finalize the budget. But yeah, so I think you're spot on your assessment.
And to continue on Ms.
Oh,
Bronga.
sorry,
oh, sorry.
Anna was in the queue.
Oh, sorry.
I didn't see her. Go ahead, Anna. Before we
That's okay. Just very briefly. Yeah, I generally do support those high level points you made. For example, moving things into general government or really moving upstream. Like so I support that. One thing I do want to note too is a lot of the appropriations were one time, and I think it'd be helpful as a follow up when we have that list is just to note, because a lot of things were intended to be one time and not recurring, and so those get subtracted out as well. And I appreciate the point that some of the things that were under here, like the safety center, got moved out. But also, and can you remind me? I think you said that we had to basically have this budget be 10 million less than last year because of the lack of fund balance. Was that right?
Through the chair to Member Brawley, yes, approximately.
I don't know that you said it was from the
Yeah,
lack of fund balance. It was from the lack of knowing if there is a fund balance of what actually got out in this year.
Well, it's a combination of both, right? As of right now, we can, we're tracking budget to actuals on how the alcohol tax appropriation for 2024 is going out the door. And for the most part, it seems like all of it has been or is going to be spent. I think under $500,000 will roll over as fund balance. As part of the ongoing process over the last few years, it has been a combination of not knowing what the fund balance is and not being able to get appropriations out the door.
Just wanted to add to the piece about one-time funding. Some of this to me comes back to how are we clearly setting terms and communicating with organizations receiving funds. I think there have been intentions that these are one-time funds, but not necessarily that that's how organizations have thought of them. And then that creates obligations to fund or creates challenges for those organizations. And so it really seems like in general, the more we can move toward clarity around what we're funding and for what term, and set really clear expectations up front, the better. And this last slide, and I think we can wrap there in our at time, is just again meant to show, as we have both our general government, but a new funding source like the Anchorage Child Care and Early Education Fund coming online, what is living in that budget? And again, how do we look across fund sources and just say, what are we funding and how is it aligning with our priorities and the needs of the community? And so we'll talk more about that later, but that's just to capture some of those items here.
All right, we're going to go ahead and break for 5 minutes. We'll come back at 11:05 to kick off the next step in the budget process.